At the height of the Roman Empire, where the discipline and training of the legions were unparalleled, enemies emerged who managed to challenge Rome's military dominance in unexpected and devastating ways. The barbarian warriors, coming from wild and unknown lands, brought to the battlefield a set of weapons and tactics that, although different from the meticulously organized Roman formations, proved to be deadly and highly effective. What exactly made these barbarians such a significant threat? Their weapons, often simple in design, were brutal in their efficiency, adapted to the rugged terrains and harsh conditions they faced. But it wasn't just the weapons that made the barbarians dangerous. Their tactics, based on ambushes, rapid attacks, and the masterful use of terrain, challenged the traditional Roman superiority on the battlefield. These warriors fought with a ferocity fueled by their culture and a deep familiarity with the environments in which they fought. In this video, we will explore in detail the weapons and tactics that made the barbarians such formidable enemies to the Roman legions. We will discover how these often underestimated peoples were able to inflict impressive defeats on the powerful Roman army, changing the course of battles and eventually contributing to the weakening of the empire. Get ready for an in-depth analysis that will reveal how the combination of innovation, adaptation, and barbarian ferocity managed to challenge one of the greatest empires in history. The fury of the battlefield, the barbarian fighting style. On the battlefield, barbarian warriors were feared for their chaotic and violent approach. While the Roman legions adhered to strict discipline, the barbarians preferred a more instinctive strategy based on brute force and ferocity. These warriors, coming from various tribes, did not follow a traditional military hierarchy, which gave them a frightening unpredictability. The intensity of their attacks, often driven by an almost religious fervor, shocked the Romans, who were accustomed to facing enemies who respected military order and protocol. Hand-to-hand combat was the barbarians' strong suit, as they would charge at the Romans with unrestrained fury. They valued close-quarters fighting, where they could use their raw strength and agility to disorient Roman soldiers, who depended on their cohesive formations. The barbarian war cry, often described as a wild roar, served not only to intimidate the enemy, but also to incite a kind of battle frenzy in their own warriors. This behavior created a chaotic combat environment, where the Romans, trained to fight in an organized manner, often lost their advantage. Moreover, the barbarians had incredible physical endurance, shaped by the harsh environment in which they lived. Coming from cold regions and difficult terrains, such as dense forests and treacherous mountains, they were used to enduring extreme conditions, giving them a psychological and physical edge over the Romans. This natural preparation for adversity made them formidable enemies, capable of fighting for long periods without showing signs of weakness or fatigue. The Romans, with their heavy armor and tactical formations, often found themselves at a disadvantage in uneven terrain. While a legion functioned as an efficient machine on open fields, this same structure could be undone in an environment that favored agility and surprise attacks. The barbarians, on the other hand, adapted quickly to the chaos of combat, exploiting gaps in Roman formations and attacking weak points with relentless brutality. This made them especially dangerous in prolonged battles, where the ability to adapt was crucial. The barbarian fighting style was also fueled by a deeply ingrained warrior culture. For many of these peoples, war was not just a political necessity, but a way of life. Barbarian warriors were trained from a young age to wield weapons and survive in adverse conditions, creating an army of hardened fighters ready for any challenge. Honor in combat was a central principle, and dying in battle was seen as one of the most glorious ways to achieve immortality, which made them even more dangerous as they fought without fear of death. Simple weapons, deadly effectiveness, barbarian war tools. Although barbarian weapons were mostly simple in design, they were devastatingly effective on the battlefield. The axe, for example, was one of the most common weapons among Germanic and Gallic warriors. This tool, often forged from rudimentary materials, had the ability to crush armor and break shields with ease. Its simplicity allowed for unparalleled versatility, as it could be used both in close combat and thrown as a long-range weapon. Another example is the short sword, or seeks, which was widely used by barbarian tribes. Smaller and lighter than the Roman gladius, this sword allowed for quick and precise movements, making it ideal for swift and deadly attacks in confined spaces. In forest battles or ambushes, where combat was hand-to-hand, the seeks proved to be a lethal weapon. The barbarians valued the use of this weapon for its simplicity and the ease with which it could be concealed or used in fast combat, surprising the Romans in close encounters. Spears were also widely used by the barbarians, especially in offensive or defensive formations. Although they were simple weapons, spears could be adapted to different combat styles. In open battles, the barbarians used long spears to keep the Romans at bay, and in ambushes, they were thrown with deadly accuracy to disorient enemy formations. Knowledge of how to use these weapons in various terrains, from forests to mountains, gave the barbarians a strategic advantage, as their weapons were adapted to the conditions of battle. The combination of wooden and iron weapons, often forged in a rudimentary manner, provided a surprise to the Romans, who expected more predictable confrontations. The brutality of these weapons, combined with the physical strength of the barbarians, allowed them to break through Roman defenses and inflict severe damage with just a few strikes. The legions, equipped with heavy shields and armor, often underestimated the impact of these simple tools, but the barbarians knew how to maximize the power of each blow, making every attack a real and immediate threat. Finally, the use of crude weaponry, such as clubs and warhammers, added a layer of unpredictability to combat. While the Romans relied on their short swords and coordinated use of shields, the barbarians introduced impact weapons that not only shattered defensive equipment, but also destabilized formations. This ability to disorient the legions was what made the combination of barbarian weapons so lethal on the battlefield. Ambushes and lightning attacks, barbarian guerrilla tactics. Barbarians were masters of guerrilla warfare, and their tactics of ambush and lightning attacks caught the Roman legions off guard. Instead of engaging in open confrontations, where the Romans typically excelled, the barbarians preferred to use the element of surprise. Hidden in dense forests or rugged terrains, they waited for the right moment to strike, often in locations that made it difficult for the legions to reorganize. This type of tactic disrupted Roman order and military discipline, forcing them to fight under adverse and unpredictable conditions. Lightning attacks were another effective tactic employed by the barbarians. These warriors moved swiftly, striking and then retreating before the Romans could respond adequately. This hit-and-run style of attack exploited the barbarians' mobility and agility, while the Romans, burdened with heavy armor and equipment, struggled to defend themselves. By disorienting the enemy and avoiding prolonged engagements, the barbarians created a constant atmosphere of insecurity for the legions, who never knew when or where the next attack would occur. Additionally, the barbarians had an intimate knowledge of the terrain in which they fought. Taking advantage of their familiarity with forests, rivers, and mountains, they turned geography into a formidable ally. The Romans, accustomed to open battlefields, were forced to fight in unfamiliar environments where uneven terrain made it difficult to maintain their cohesive formations. Ambushes in narrow trails or attacks in narrow ravines destabilized the Roman line, creating confusion and making the use of conventional tactics impossible. Another important aspect of barbarian tactics was the ability to mobilize quickly. Entire tribes could move silently through forests or fields, suddenly appearing to attack Roman caravans, outposts, or even small isolated legions. This ability to move rapidly and strike unexpectedly gave the impression that the barbarians were everywhere at once, creating a sense of fear and vulnerability among the Romans. The legions were forced to fight in a constant state of alert, which wore down their soldiers both physically and psychologically. Barbarian ambushes were not just a matter of military strategy, but also an expression of cultural resistance. Many of these warriors were defending their lands, and the use of guerrilla tactics reflected their desperate struggle for survival against the powerful Roman army. For the barbarians, ambushing and disorienting the enemy was not just a way to win battles, but also a clear message. The Roman legions were not invincible, and their enemies, no matter how savage they were considered, had an impressive ability to inflict significant defeats. The terrain as an ally. Tactical advantage in barbarian lands. One of the greatest advantages of barbarian warriors was their deep knowledge of the terrain in which they fought. While the Romans relied on maps and scouts to navigate unknown lands, the barbarians had a natural familiarity with their environment. This allowed them to use dense forests, mountainous terrain, and rushing rivers as tactical weapons. These warriors knew where to hide their troops, how to move silently, and most importantly, how to lure the enemy into deadly traps. The terrain was as lethal as their weapons. Forests, for example, were the perfect setting for devastating ambushes. The Romans, with their rigid formations and heavy armor, struggled to move with agility among the dense trees. In contrast, the barbarians, accustomed to hunting and surviving in these conditions, used the environment to their advantage. They could easily hide, stalk their enemies, and attack from all sides, completely disorienting the legions. By the time the Romans finally responded, it was often too late, as most of the barbarians had already retreated to prepare for the next attack. Mountainous terrain also posed a significant challenge for the Romans. In mountain combats, the mobility and local knowledge of the barbarians stood out. They attacked from elevated positions, taking advantage of the tactical benefits provided by the terrain. The Romans, on the other hand, had to contend with the weight of their armor and equipment, making them easy targets on steep descents or narrow passes. Ambushes in these regions were especially effective, with the barbarians throwing stones, spears, and other weapons from above, impeding the advance of the legions. Rivers and swampy areas were also strategically exploited. Many barbarians were adept swimmers and could cross rivers with agility, unlike the Romans, who avoided combat in flooded regions. Tribes such as the Germans and Gauls used these natural obstacles to divide and isolate Roman forces. In situations where the Romans were forced to traverse these difficult terrains, the barbarians would attack when the soldiers were most vulnerable, disrupting their formations and making coordinated defense impossible. The barbarians' ability to use the terrain as an extension of their combat tactics was a decisive factor in many of the defeats they inflicted on the Romans. While the legions needed predictable battlefields to maximize their efficiency, the barbarians turned every corner of their lands into a potential trap. This symbiosis between the barbarian warrior and their environment made each battle a struggle not only against human enemies, but against nature itself. The fall of Roman invincibility. Major defeats inflicted by barbarians. Some of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history were inflicted by barbarian warriors, demonstrating how the Romans, despite their military superiority, could be beaten by underestimated enemies. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD is one of the most striking examples. In this confrontation, the Germanic tribes led by Arminius managed to annihilate 3 Roman legions in a meticulously planned ambush. The use of the forested terrain and strategic surprise were crucial to the barbarian victory, and the defeat was so devastating that Rome never attempted to conquer Germania again. Another significant example is the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, where the Goths defeated the Roman army of Emperor Valens. Although the Goths had initially sought refuge within Roman borders, tensions quickly escalated into conflict. When the Romans underestimated the barbarian mobilization power and combat tactics, they were caught off guard. This defeat was particularly notable as it resulted in the death of the emperor himself and profoundly shook Roman confidence in their invincibility, marking the beginning of the decline of the Western Roman Empire. The Battle of the Allia in 390 BC is another defeat that echoed in Roman memory. In this clash, the Gauls led by Brennus invaded Rome after defeating the Roman army in a battle marked by disorganization and panic among the legions. The city of Rome was sacked, and the episode was famously marked by Brennus' phrase, "Vi victis," woe to the vanquished. Although the Romans eventually recovered, The defeat at Allia demonstrated that even the capital of the empire could fall before barbarian forces, delivering a deep blow to Roman pride. The barbarians were also responsible for a series of raids and plundering along the Roman frontiers, which, although not resulting in epic battles, wore down the resources and morale of the legions. Tribes such as the Huns, Visigoths, and Vandals exploited the weaknesses of the empire's borders, pillaging cities and villages with impunity. The sack of Rome by the Vandals in 455 AD was a symbolic blow that shook the Roman world, showing that the once invincible capital of the empire was vulnerable before the savage barbarians. These defeats, spread over centuries, showed that despite their superior training and discipline, Roman legions could be challenged and defeated by barbarian forces employing innovative tactics, terrain knowledge, and brutality as strategic weapons. Over time, these enemies were able to wear down Roman hegemony, and their victories not only marked the military decline of Rome, but also the beginning of a new era where the once invincible empire slowly succumbed to the fringes of barbarian power.